You've been stuck inside for 3 days because of rain. You have a roof, you have heating, you have a refrigerator full of food and a phone full of distractions, and you're miserable. Now take all of that away. No roof, no walls, no stored food, no dry clothes, no waterproof jacket, no hot drink. Put yourself in a forest somewhere, in prehistoric Europe, 60,000 years ago, in the middle of a rainy season that simply does not let up for weeks at a time. The temperature is sitting just above the number that would actually kill you. Fire, food, warmth, every single thing you need to stay alive gets harder to obtain the wetter the world gets around you. How do you survive that? Not as a hypothetical. In your actual life, every year, for the overwhelming majority of the time, humans have existed on this planet. This is a question almost nobody thinks to ask about ancient humans, because we're usually far more interested in the dramatic stuff, the predators, the migrations, the wars. But rain is unglamorous, relentless, and was arguably a more consistent killer of early humans than almost anything with teeth. It smothered fires, it caused hypothermia, it rotted stored food, it flooded shelters, it lasted for months at a stretch, and ancient humans didn't just survive it. They thrived in some of the wettest, most punishing climates on the planet, crossed genuine rainforests, and lived straight through Ice Age winters with precipitation levels that would shut a modern city down completely. They worked out, with no textbooks and no waterproof fabric, how to keep an entire species alive in conditions that would end most people reading this within a matter of days. Let's actually walk through how. Start with the most immediate physical problem rain creates for an unprotected human body. Not drowning, that's a separate issue entirely. The real killer is heat loss, and the physics behind it is genuinely brutal. Water conducts heat away from the human body roughly 25 times faster than still air does. That is not a small difference. It's the gap between sitting in a chilly room feeling mildly uncomfortable and sitting in a cold lake actively dying. Once you're wet, your body starts losing heat at a rate your own metabolism may simply be unable to keep pace with, especially the moment ambient temperature drops and wind starts moving across your skin. This is exactly why hypothermia kills so efficiently in wet conditions, even when it's nowhere near freezing. You don't need ice for it to happen. You need wet clothing, a light breeze, and a temperature hovering somewhere around 10 degrees Celsius, which describes an entirely ordinary British summer evening, or a spring night across most of temperate Europe, or a perfectly unremarkable afternoon in dozens of the environments early humans actually lived in. Ancient humans understood this danger with total clarity, not from any theory of thermodynamics, but from watching it happen to people around them. Which means the single most critical survival skill in wet conditions was never finding food or building shelter first. It was maintaining core body temperature, full stop, and the strategies ancient humans built around doing exactly that were considerably more sophisticated than most people assume. Start with fire, because fire is the obvious answer here, and also a genuinely complicated one once rain enters the picture. Fire and rain are natural enemies. Wet wood won't take a flame. Wet tinder won't catch a spark. A fire that gets properly rained on simply dies, and a dead fire in an already hypothermic situation isn't an inconvenience. It's closer to a death sentence written directly in wet ash. So how did ancient humans actually keep fire alive through sustained rain? The honest answer is that they stopped thinking about fire as something you make when you need it, and started treating it the way you'd treat infrastructure, something maintained continuously rather than an event you trigger on demand. Starting a fire completely from scratch in wet conditions, using nothing but bare hands and natural materials, is genuinely one of the hardest physical tasks a human being can attempt, so instead, they carried it. Across virtually every studied ancient culture, embers wrapped in slow-burning organic material, damp moss, certain fungus, or specific bark, could be kept smoldering for hours while a group was actively traveling. Different cultures developed their own version of this same solution independently, carrying live embers inside enclosed containers or wrapped in particular slow-burning woods across genuinely long distances. Archaeological hearth sites across Europe show evidence of fires that burned continuously across years, not relit again and again from cold, but actively maintained, fed, and protected the entire time, treated less like a tool and more like a living thing that needed tending. That need created something else, one of the earliest divisions of labor visible anywhere in the archaeological record. In bad weather, someone's job was specifically to keep the fire alive, not to hunt, not to forage. To sit beside it, shield it from wind and rain, feed it steadily, and make certain the group didn't wake up cold and in total darkness in the middle of a storm. Long before anyone specialized in toolmaking or hunting or medicine, someone had already become a fire specialist. But fire itself needs shelter to survive heavy rain, which brings us to the second major strategy. Ancient humans were not the cave-dwelling primitives popular imagination tends to picture, and honestly, that image is partly just an artifact of what happens to survive archaeologically. Caves preserve evidence extremely well, so caves are naturally where we go looking, and from that, we've quietly built a broader assumption that caves are where ancient humans generally lived. But caves are genuinely rare, often already occupied by dangerous animals, frequently cold and damp themselves, and geographically limited to begin with. Most ancient humans lived in structures they actively built, and even the very earliest of these show a level of environmental problem-solving that's genuinely impressive to look at closely. The oldest confirmed constructed shelter, at a site in France called Terra Amata, dates to roughly 400,000 years ago, built by Homo heidelbergensis, well before our own species existed at all. These weren't elaborate structures, but they were absolutely intentional. Oval frameworks of branches braced by stones, leaves, and hides layered across the top in overlapping rows, each layer covering the seam of the one beneath it, so rain sheds off the surface instead of soaking straight through. That's the same underlying principle a modern roof still uses today, arrived at independently, with zero engineering education, by hominins whose brains were somewhat smaller than yours. By the time fully modern humans were spreading out across the globe, temporary shelters had become remarkably refined, given the materials actually available. Structures built from mammoth bone, discovered at sites like Mezhirich in Eastern Europe and dating to roughly 15,000 years ago, show genuinely deliberate architectural thinking. Heavy bones anchored directly into the ground to resist strong wind, hides stretched tightly across the resulting frame, likely with insulating layers packed inside. These weren't holes people crawled into to hide, they were engineered environments, purpose-built to hold heat in and keep moisture firmly out. The hide construction itself deserves real attention here, because it represents one of the more important material innovations in the entire human story, and it developed specifically as a direct response to cold, wet climates. Properly prepared animal hide is nearly waterproof on its own, since the natural fat content in untreated hide already provides real water resistance before any further processing happens at all. When ancient humans began the multi-step work of turning raw hide into a genuinely usable material, scraping it clean, stretching it, treating it with rendered fat or animal brains, smoking it over a fire, they were effectively inventing leather from first principles. And leather, as a material, is remarkable. Flexible, durable, thermally insulating once dry, and considerably more water-resistant than any woven plant fiber available at the time. The cognitive leap required to get from this animal with skin to I can turn that skin into something that protects my own skin isn't trivial at all. It requires understanding cause and effect stretched across a genuinely delayed timeline. The animal is killed today. The hide is processed over several days. The finished garment protects against weather that hasn't even arrived yet, weeks later. That's planning in the fullest sense, abstract thinking applied to a problem that doesn't exist yet, but reliably will. Archaeological evidence of dedicated hide-scraping tools recovered in Africa places this behavior at roughly 120,000 years ago, and possibly considerably earlier, predating what researchers typically define as fully modern behavior, which strongly suggests staying dry was a serious enough evolutionary pressure to produce genuinely sophisticated cognitive solutions very early in the human story. Rain didn't just threaten ancient humans. In a very real sense, it helped make them smarter. Now consider something that gets almost no attention in the popular picture of ancient survival at all: landscape reading. Modern humans experience weather as something that simply happens to us. We check an app, we get caught out anyway sometimes, and we go back inside. We've effectively outsourced weather awareness to technology, and the underlying skill has quietly atrophied as a result. Ancient humans had no such option available to them. Their survival depended on reading the surrounding environment constantly, anticipating weather well before it actually arrived, and reacting to observations most modern people would never even register. The distinctive smell of rain approaching, known today as petrichor, is a genuine, measurable olfactory signal. So is animal behavior, which visibly shifts hours ahead of an approaching storm, birds flying noticeably lower, insects swarming differently, and certain animals actively moving toward higher ground. Cloud color and texture, sudden shifts in wind direction. the changing behavior of open water surfaces. All of it carries real, usable meteorological information. And ancient humans learned to read these signals the way you read a road sign, automatically and fluently, because their continued survival genuinely depended on it. Group decisions about shelter and movement were very likely made hours ahead of actual rainfall, based entirely on this kind of accumulated environmental literacy. You don't get caught helplessly in a downpour when you've been reading the sky carefully all day and still have 3 full hours of daylight left to find high ground and finish building rain cover before the storm actually hits. This kind of environmental awareness runs so deep in traditional peoples still practicing it today that researchers studying these communities consistently describe a level of weather sensitivity that can look almost supernatural to outside observers from heavily industrialized backgrounds. It isn't magic, it's expertise, specifically the kind of expertise that only develops when getting the weather wrong genuinely means the difference between living and dying, practiced daily, refined across generations, and deliberately passed forward through direct teaching and observation. We used to have this. We traded it for a weather app. The app is certainly convenient. Something real was still lost in that exchange. There's also the specific matter of where ancient humans actually chose to make camp in the first place, because a significant share of their survival came down to reading terrain itself, not just sky. Elevation matters enormously once conditions turn wet. Cold air sinks, wet air pools naturally in low ground. On a genuinely rainy night, the practical difference between camping on a slight rise and camping down in a shallow hollow can be the difference between waking up merely damp and waking up sitting directly in several inches of cold standing water. Ancient humans understood this the same way a modern plumber understands that water runs downhill, through direct, repeated, practical observation, carrying immediate and occasionally brutal consequences for getting it wrong. South-facing slopes dry out measurably faster after rain in the northern hemisphere. Canopy density directly determines how much actual rainfall reaches the ground beneath it, and dense broadleaf or conifer cover can intercept a genuinely significant share of light to moderate rain before it ever touches the forest floor, which is exactly why ancient humans camped beneath it deliberately and repeatedly. Natural rock overhangs, used as shelter across essentially every inhabited continent, weren't a fallback for people incapable of building. They were simply a head start on waterproofing that saved real hours of construction labor. Knowledge of which specific spots across a given landscape offered genuinely the best natural shelter accumulated over years of repeated use and was carried forward through direct instruction, generation after generation. Groups returned to the same proven sheltering spots seasonally, the same way they returned reliably to known hunting grounds and foraging areas, and this shows up clearly in the archaeological record itself. Sites with repeated habitation stretched across thousands of years, layers of ash, bone, and worked tools stacked directly on top of each other in the same physical location. The spot worked. Everyone who came before already knew that. They made sure to tell the people who came after. Landscape knowledge and rain survival were never really separate things. They were the same body of knowledge. Now consider the body itself, because ancient humans also carried genuine physiological advantages in cold, wet conditions that modern lifestyle has partially eroded, and that some researchers now believe we've lost more completely than most people realize. Start with the cold shock response. Falling suddenly into cold water, and your body triggers an immediate cascade: sharp, involuntary inhalation, rapid hyperventilation, real cardiovascular stress, a largely automatic reaction responsible for a genuinely significant share of cold water drowning deaths, including among people who are otherwise strong, confident swimmers in warm conditions. This response is partly learned sensitivity, and people regularly exposed to cold water immersion, cold weather generally, show measurably reduced cold shock responses over time as their bodies gradually adapt. Ancient humans were cold regularly and wet regularly, exposed to genuine daily temperature variation in a way no modern human living inside climate-controlled buildings can meaningfully approximate. Their baseline physiological response to cold and wet was calibrated by constant, repeated exposure in a way ours simply no longer is. They weren't tougher because they were fundamentally different people. They were tougher because they were trained by an environment that never once offered the option of simply turning up a thermostat. There's also the matter of fat distribution and broader metabolic adaptation. Populations adapted over many generations to cold, wet climates show measurably different metabolic profiles compared to sedentary populations living in temperature-controlled environments today. with higher resting metabolic rates under cold conditions, more efficient direct heat generation from brown adipose tissue, specifically, a distinct type of fat that generates warmth directly rather than simply storing energy for later. These adaptations are partly genetic, built up gradually across generations of selection pressure in cold environments, but they're also partly physiological and actively maintained through regular, ongoing cold exposure. Inuit populations remain the most extensively studied example, adapted over thousands of years to some of the wettest, coldest conditions humans have ever deliberately chosen to inhabit. And critically, many of these same adaptations appear to some measurable degree in essentially any human regularly exposed to cold, regardless of ancestry. The body genuinely responds to demand. It always has. Ancient humans surviving wet, cold climates weren't managing to survive despite their bodies. They were surviving because of bodies that had been actively shaped over both a single lifetime and across many generations, specifically to handle exactly those conditions. Not better humans, better prepared ones. Now consider the social dimension of all this, because this is genuinely where ancient rain survival gets most interesting, and it's rarely discussed. Surviving sustained rain completely alone is extremely difficult. Surviving it as a coordinated group is dramatically more manageable, and the social structures of ancient human bands were built, in real part, around exactly this kind of collective environmental threat management. Shared body heat is a real, physically measurable survival mechanism. A group of people huddled together beneath a single rain cover generates and retains warmth collectively in a way no isolated individual ever can. Ancient humans understood this directly. Sleeping arrangements in cold, wet conditions were dense, communal, and thoroughly pragmatic. Privacy, in this specific context, is genuinely a warm-weather luxury. When it's cold and wet, you sleep pressed close against other warm bodies without a second thought about it. The fire-tending role mentioned earlier was really just one visible piece of a much broader system of weather-related labor division. Anthropologists studying traditional groups consistently find an implicit, almost automatic allocation of tasks, specifically during bad weather. Younger, more physically capable individuals handle gathering and shelter maintenance. Older, more experienced individuals make the harder calls about movement timing and shelter placement. Children are kept centrally positioned, warm, and physically shielded by the adult bodies surrounding them. The group itself effectively functions as a single thermoregulation system, not merely a social unit layered on top of survival. Which is exactly why the popular image of a single ancient human battling the elements entirely alone is, mostly, a modern invention. Solitary survival through genuinely hostile weather without modern equipment is possible for short stretches by specifically trained individuals. Across weeks and months of an actual sustained rainy season, humans survived as groups, essentially without exception. The social bond wasn't some optional feature layered on top of ancient life. It was core survival infrastructure. There's a related knowledge transmission dimension worth sitting with directly. Everything that actually worked, the specific ember-carrying technique, the exact hide waterproofing method, the reading of pre-storm animal behavior, the particular tree species whose bark burns slowly enough to transport safely, none of it was reinvented independently by every new generation from scratch. It was taught, passed forward from older individuals to younger ones through direct instruction, close observation, and repeated hands-on practice. A group's accumulated knowledge of exactly how to survive its own specific environment was arguably one of its single most valuable assets, quite possibly the most valuable one it had. When a group lost its elders, to violence, to illness, to simple old age, it didn't just lose people, it lost genuinely irreplaceable institutional knowledge, and the death of an experienced elder inside a hunter-gatherer group functioned as a real survival event for everyone remaining, not merely a social loss. Which is very likely part of why deliberate care for older, no longer fully productive individuals shows up surprisingly early in the archaeological record. Looking after people who could no longer fully participate in active foraging or physical construction wasn't abstract altruism. It was the entirely rational preservation of a group's hard-won, accumulated rain survival knowledge. Now consider food, because sustained rain doesn't pause hunger. And prolonged wet weather creates a very specific set of nutritional problems ancient humans had to solve using whatever their immediate landscape actually offered them. Extended rain changes food availability dramatically. Animals shelter defensively and become genuinely harder to track and hunt. Normally reliable plant foods, seeds, dried berries, and roots meant to be dug up become waterlogged, buried under mud, or simply inaccessible for days at a stretch. The fires needed to cook whatever food remained became considerably harder to maintain. That combination, reduced availability layered on top of increased caloric demand from cold, creates a genuine nutritional squeeze that an unprepared group could not survive for long. Ancient humans managed it through several parallel strategies. First, deliberate food storage, evidence for which appears deep in the prehistoric record, caches of nuts, dried meat, preserved fish buried in cool ground or stored in elevated structures, specifically to stay above rising moisture. This isn't instinct, this is genuine foresight, an active recognition that the season will inevitably change, that today's available food may simply not be there tomorrow, and that the resulting gap needs to be bridged by planning rather than hope. Second, ancient humans in wet conditions shifted their food targets opportunistically toward exactly what the rain itself was producing. Earthworms surface in genuinely large numbers after heavy rainfall. Freshwater fish move in predictable patterns during flooding. Certain mushrooms and fungi fruit prolifically in wet conditions. Snails, insects, and frogs all become considerably more accessible in wet weather precisely because they're responding to the same moisture ancient humans were tracking. People paying close attention, and they were always paying close attention, adjusted what they ate accordingly. The menu shifted with the weather. That flexibility wasn't a personality trait. It was a survival trait, full stop. Third, and arguably most important of all, the group ate together and shared food equitably through lean periods. Hoarding food individually during a genuine survival stretch actively reduces the entire group's collective resilience. A single well-fed individual sitting inside a group of starving people isn't really a survivor at all. They're simply a casualty waiting for the rest of the group to fall apart around them first. The sharing norms visible across essentially every hunter-gatherer society ever studied by anthropologists exist, in real part, precisely because sustained cooperation through lean, wet, genuinely difficult seasons is what actually keeps everyone alive together. It was actively prepared for, adapted to, and shared through, deliberately, as a group. One final zoom out on where ancient humans actually chose to live at all, because it reveals something genuinely striking about their real relationship with wet weather. Modern humans, given a genuine choice, tend to gravitate toward moderate climates, not too hot, not too cold, and certainly not too wet. And you can still see this preference clearly in population density maps today. Temperate, seasonally stable regions consistently attract and retain more people than climate extremes ever do. Ancient humans simply didn't have that particular luxury available to them. They went everywhere, into monsoon-soaked regions of Southeast Asia, into the perpetually damp temperate rainforests of coastal Europe, into river delta systems that flooded seasonally with real, predictable violence, into subarctic regions where precipitation is nearly constant, and the ground itself stays wet or frozen for most of the year. And critically, they didn't settle these places despite the rain. In a great many cases, they settled there specifically because of what the rain actually brought with it. Wet environments are, almost without exception, extraordinarily productive environments. Rivers and lakes fed by heavy rainfall run thick with fish. Wet forests overflow with plants, fungi, and animal life that all depend directly on that same moisture to thrive. The same rain that made day-to-day life genuinely difficult was simultaneously what made the local food supply rich. Ancient humans made a calculation, almost certainly not a fully conscious one, but visible clearly in the long-term drift of populations toward resources, that the real difficulty of surviving wet conditions was consistently worth the abundance those same conditions reliably produced. That's a fundamentally different relationship with weather than the one most modern people carry around today. We tend to experience rain purely as an interruption, something that cancels plans and ruins otherwise good days. Ancient humans experienced rain as a condition, one that demanded real management, created genuine opportunity, and required great accumulated skill, but was never treated as something fundamentally alien or automatically hostile. It was simply part of the world they lived in. They were part of it too, the carefully waterproofed hide that carried a live ember for miles. The overlapping angled branches shed water in layered rows exactly like a modern roof. A group huddled tightly around a fire, inside a structure someone spent 3 focused hours building because the sky had already told them, hours earlier, that the weather was turning. The south-facing slope was chosen deliberately because it drains faster than the ground around it. The food cache, buried weeks in advance for precisely a week exactly like this one. All of it points toward the same single conclusion. Ancient humans didn't merely survive rain. They built an entire working system of technique, accumulated knowledge, and social structure specifically engineered to manage it. And that system, that hard-won practical intelligence about how a genuinely wet world actually behaves, was considerably more sophisticated and more precisely calibrated to real conditions than most modern people ever give it credit for. We have a synthetic waterproof fabric now. We have insulated walls, central heating, weather radar, and drainage systems engineered to move rainwater safely away from our buildings before we've even fully registered that it arrived. But every single piece of that technology exists downstream of a very long, very wet, firelit night somewhere deep in our past, when someone worked out, through nothing but direct necessity, that water runs consistently downhill, that a properly built shelter keeps smoke and rain out at the same time, that certain rendered animal fats make hide close to genuinely waterproof, and that staying physically close to other warm human bodies is very often the actual difference between making it to morning and not. Every modern technology we now use to manage rain traces directly back to that same wet, cold, firelit lineage of trial and error. They figured all of it out first, with none of the tools we now take completely for granted, using nothing but time, patient attention, knowledge passed carefully forward, and a stubborn, species-wide refusal to simply lie down and accept getting rained on. That was never primitive survival. That was the actual foundation on which everything else was eventually built.